In the last slide deck, we talked about the history of a classical liberal arts education and discussed why rhetoric is an important component to cultivating the ability to think, reason, and be at home in the realm of ideas. So how does one acquire rhetorical ability? Is rhetoric an intuitive gift, or is it an art that can be learned? Well, I say it's an art. Why? Because rhetoric must be approached as an art in order to fully appropriate its benefit. Well, why is this so? Well, it is so because everyone thinks, argues, and communicates ideas already. Remember, we do this intuitively. We can't help it. We're human beings, and that's how humans are designed. However, there's a big difference between intuition and art. And so in order to master any body of knowledge as an art, one must define it, break it into its parts, and practice. Let's look at an interesting definition of the word Techne by Joseph Dunn to help us understand how we might acquire rhetoric as an art. Joseph Dunn defines art, or techne, in Back to the Rough Ground as the kind of knowledge possessed by an expert maker. It gives him a clear conception of the why and wherefore, the how and the what with of the making process, and enables him through the capacity to offer a rational account of it to preside over his activity with secure mastery. You see, there's no substitute for theory when one sets out to master an art. As has been established elsewhere, imparting such practical arts is the aim of a liberal arts education. So we want to be able to take theory and put it into practice. If you would think back to the classical orators of Roman times, we can think for a moment to Cicero, who comments that there's a big difference between intuition and art. Cicero claims that while some men are gifted with rhetorical skill, others may learn with practice to acquire it. Therefore, in order to master the art of rhetoric, or to master any body of knowledge as an art, one must define it, break it into its parts, study the parts, and then practice. And that's exactly what we have to do when we set out to master the art of rhetoric. So now let's ask this question. What question is at the heart, then, of liberal classical education? Well, it is this. What knowledge must we have in order to be fully human? And in order to begin examining how rhetoric fits into a liberal arts education from a classical perspective, and by extension to apply it to our modern lives, in order for us to do this, and in order for us to acquire rhetoric as an art, we must make rhetoric become part of our daily hexis. Well, let's define this term. What is hexis? The denotative definition of hexis is habit, or to be habituated. Its connotative definition is something that's second nature. So if we apply it to rhetorical principles or the art of rhetoric, we would say that rhetorical principles should become second nature in our communication practices. It's vitally important that rhetoric becomes second nature to us. Let me demonstrate why. A modern writer from the 20th century has called rhetoric the most humane of all the humanities. Let's see if we can figure out why Richard Weaver would call rhetoric the most humane of all the humanities. Well, first of all, if we go back to the classical writers, Aristotle begins his Rhetorica by asserting that rhetoric is a counterpart to dialectic. What he means by this is that rhetoric and dialectic are parallel faculties. They have no subject matter of their own. They deal with similar matters, and they share a common root. Aristotle also notes that rhetoric is a counterpart of ethics insofar as one ought to rightly relate to one's audience. One ought to speak truthfully, exercise goodwill toward the audience, and so on. Aristotle's take on ethics also results in some of the earliest reflections on psychology. Well, why? Because in order to rightly relate to an audience, one must first understand what makes people tick. We have to understand that in general, and then one must also do a bit of audience analysis. Not that one must learn to tickle the ears of the audience, but it is impossible to persuade an audience that has been alienated. As a result, Aristotle spends a great deal of time in his treatise discussing, for example, various temperaments and the types of arguments that would appeal to most in each category. So dialectic, ethics, psychology, and rhetoric are all closely related. Next is history. History is related to rhetoric because, according to Richard Weaver's interpretations of classical rhetoric, rhetoric deals with questions that arise out of history. And we'll talk more about that as we examine Weaver's essay, The Cultural Role of Rhetoric. In the meantime, though, let's agree to this idea. Rhetoric speaks to man in his whole being and out of his whole past, and with reference to values which only a human being can intuit. Another quotation from Weaver's Cultural Role of Rhetoric, which we will discuss later in the course. Similarly, in the Middle Ages, if it hadn't been for training in hermeneutics and homiletics, equipping the priests to teach and preach the good news, rhetoric may have been lost to the West. So rhetorical principles have been very important in advancing the position of the gospel. Poetics, the study of style, is also important and related to rhetoric. In order to give one's arguments substance, they must have both style and historicity. In other words, it is not as powerful to argue for say, a dam project by which one uses just abstract arguments regarding hydroelectric power and the wonders of engineering, as it would be to compare the proposed project with what has been done in similar situations in the past. So there's an appeal to history. And likewise, a bare-bones argument will not carry as much weight as one that evokes vivid images in the audience's imagination. So here is an appeal to poetry, or a poetic sense of style. In the Roman era, rhetorical doctrine was brought forward primarily in the law schools, and rhetorical training was the means of equipping one to plead one's case in front of the judiciary. And we can see that even in our own modern society today, how much our three branches of government rely back or look back to these divisions that classical rhetoric supported. Of course, politics and rhetoric have also always been closely associated, which explains to some extent why rhetoric has a negative connotation today. Oftentimes we hear people say, oh, that's just a bunch of rhetoric in reference to something political. Well, let's ask ourselves, what does a deliberative body do? They argue the relative merits of competing policy proposals. And of course, this is an utterly rhetorical enterprise. Consider these relationships in toto, or in other words, entirely or completely. Rhetoric either depends upon or is highly implicated in all of these arts, and they are all very humane arts. In other words, they are part of what makes us human. That is the sense in which rhetoric was considered for most of the past 2,500 years, at various times in its development, the queen of the liberal arts. It's the cornerstone of liberal education. And, as Weaver puts it, it's the most humanistic of all the disciplines. So the aim of a liberal arts education is human excellence. We talked about that in the previous slide deck. And as one practices the art of rhetoric and rhetorical reasoning, one must do this until it becomes second nature, or hexis, habit, until one realizes human excellence. That is why, in its golden age, rhetoric was considered to be the most humane of the humanities.